sort of acceptance of your existence, and it's gonna be okay.
Right, but I think even the paranoia is like a sort of meme, you could say. I think the concept of a bad trip is a very damaging concept. Because, and I know from personal experience, I never really used psychedelics in high school, with the exception of salvia, because I was terrified of a bad trip. I'd talk to friends who describe bad trips, and they'd say, oh, it's a bad trip. It's really bad, it's scary. And I would think, oh, that's terrible. I would never want a bad trip. I'm never going to touch these things. Because a bad trip would be too much for me to tolerate. And then I started using psychedelics and I realized there's no such thing as a bad trip. But I think even these bad trips, although they can be difficult, are beneficial in our learning experience in the same way that a bad meal could be. You learn not to go to that restaurant, or maybe you learn something about what makes you sick or what to be careful of in the future. You know, if you are approaching life from a non-fearful perspective, where your intention is to learn, then you can extract benefit from almost any experience. And these difficult psychedelic experiences, I genuinely believe, and this is what is maybe the hardest thing to communicate about psychedelics, is that it's the difficult ones that are often the best. Those are the ones that really teach you something. Because that's a confrontation with the overarching fear. The fear that generates all other fears, and if you conquer that fear, then your life will almost certainly improve.
I'm here with Hamilton Morris. Hamilton, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I think a good place to start is you are clearly very interested in drugs, but also in a way that departs from how society tends to view them. How did you end up so interested in this topic and in that way?
I think that I grew up at a time when a lot of the vestiges of the golden age of prohibition were still very much present in the media and in the classroom. So, I went through DARE. I was exposed to a lot of kind of the most ridiculous propaganda to have emerged in the 20th century. I saw all of the absurd journalism that was being produced in the 90s and is still produced to this day. And I think that anyone that went through that had a certain perspective, almost a privileged perspective on the way things work and how much misrepresentation appears and how much manipulation is part of the way drugs are discussed in American culture. And once you take a step outside of that indoctrination, you realize that there's a lot more going on. There's a really rich history. And I think that, that was the case for a lot of people, especially with cannabis, but with psychedelics as well, and even with stimulants, you begin to realize that there's a basic desire to help people, to prevent people from hurting themselves with drugs. And out of a misguided but positive aim of helping people, all of this misinformation is spread. And so you start to think, okay, well, maybe the best tactic would be to actually be as honest as possible. And what might that achieve? And that's sort of the goal that I've had, is to try to not swing the pendulum too far in one direction or the other in terms of scaring people or trying to convince people that psychoactive drugs are a cure for all of society's ills, but to stay somewhere in the middle, so that people can trust what you're saying.
What was your initial point of contact with a more accurate view on drugs? Was it through personal experience you began to realize that what you were hearing was not true, or did you get into the science and see that what the science was saying was different from what, say, a DARE teacher would tell you?
I had a very unusual childhood, and I grew up in Cambridge. A lot of my parents' friends were intellectuals, and I remember as a very young child, there was this a psychiatrist at Harvard named John Micc, who is sort of the foremost expert on alien abduction phenomenon. I don't know if you're about this guy?
No, I'm not.
He's a really interesting person, and he wrote a great book called Abduction in the 90s that sort of contextualized alien abduction phenomena in the same realm as religious experience and shamanic transformations, and kind of positioned it as part of this.
Demons be gone.
Be gone, demons.
Be gone.
Leave this studio!
Okay, I've heard, and I don't know if this is true, so what's your opinion on it? I've heard that really large doses of shrooms are similar to ayahuasca experiences, or I guess 5-MeO-DMT experiences. Is that true?
There's a really substantial structural overlap between psilocin and psilocybin and DMT. At the experience of a high dose of psilocin and the experience of a high dose of DMT are quite similar. But again, you can do things with DMT that you can't really do with psilocin or psilocybin, where most, let's say, responsible or somewhat reasonable people wouldn't want to take an insanely high dose of psilocybin, and people will maybe disagree with me about that. But I would say
what's an insanely high dose of psilocybin?
Let's say 50 milligrams.
Okay, what is that in grams of shrooms?
Maybe a quarter ounce, something like that.
Okay, yeah, that's quite a bit.
Yeah. And yeah, most people wouldn't want to do that. Why? Because it's not really necessary to do that. You can get almost everything that you would want to get or need to get from a dose half that much. Again, people will disagree with me on this. They'll say it's completely different at much higher doses. That's fine. I know plenty of people that, for whatever reason, seem to have gotten a lot of benefit from taking these extremely high doses. For the majority of people, it's totally unnecessary. But something like DMT is really interesting because it allows you to have that type of experience that someone might have at a very, very high dose of mushrooms, but to explore it in a slightly more controlled manner because the duration is so short that you don't have to worry about how am I going to navigate this for the next 4 or 5 hours. So that's
Okay.
That's
Yeah, I had a wild experience. I did 8 grams of mushrooms and had a pretty intense experience that was quite different from the usual 3.5 grams that I took. It was wild. It was great. It was amazing. It was transformative. But I haven't delved a lot into other ones. I'm looking to try ayahuasca at one point.
I was in West Africa a couple times this winter, and what really struck me was how aggressive and painful the iboga ceremonies were for people. I mean, really something I would say so extreme that it would never even be considered viable or permissible in the United States certainly not in the United States in any kind of medical framework, but really even within a kind of new age community, it would be considered totally unacceptable because it involved so much fasting, such extreme exertion, all of this stuff. But the people that I met that did this really felt that they had benefited from it. And my own slightly less extreme participation in those ceremonies, which did involve fasting, was amazing. How
long did you fast for?
Not very long at all. A day.
Demons be gone.
Be gone, demons.
Be gone.
Leave this studio!
Leave this planet.
The psychosomatic effects of belief are truly incredible. And you'll see things that defy, logical, empirical reasoning.
The flip side is that there's a lot of things that we can do, and we're just too afraid to do it.
It's just interesting what the different psychoactive compounds, kind of allow, and which way you can kind of bend them depending on the intention of whoever's providing it.
Right, yeah, I think
most people don't appreciate how versatile most of these compounds really are. It depends on, what the ends are, what you're trying to achieve. I mean, I had a really interesting friendship with this PCP chemist in Compton, who tragically died when his lab blew up. But before he died, we would talk a lot about chemistry. In some sense, he was a chemist in that was his job. That was where his money came from. His entire adult life, he'd synthesized PCP, and it was his livelihood. But he had no concept of what a molecule was, had never taken a chemistry class, and didn't understand on a molecular level anything that he was doing. So he had this folk chemistry understanding that I could see why he said the things that he said, because based on his observation of these reactions, it made intuitive sense if you didn't understand what's happening on an electronic molecular level.
That's pretty wild. So he just knew how to do it, and then created his own legend surrounding it, which is pretty much what every indigenous culture has kind of had to do. You have these things that all of a sudden you mix them, you boil them, you do them, and you create what feels nothing short of magic. When you're ingesting a lot of these compounds, how the fuck do you describe that? If you don't have the microscopes and all the analysis that we have available.
And even with the analysis, when it comes to actually describing the qualitative effects, we're no better than anyone else. We have no real tools. Maybe we have some surveys and things like that can give a quantitative edge to the more mythological interpretations of the action of these substances. But for the most part, we're all doing the same thing. We're just describing what we experience.
Yeah, totally.
Let's pick up the biography again, the linear biography, and go to college.
Yeah.
So you go to school, where and for what?
I go to the University of Chicago. I'm interested in neuroscience more than chemistry at that time, and that was sort of an interesting time also. Around 2006 was when I was a freshman, where there was a kind of this growing obsession with pop neuroscience. But I think that people they'd sort of decided neuroscience explains human behavior. So if we're going to understand love, and we're going to understand violence, and we're going to understand decision making, forget psychology, that old pseudoscience of psychology. We need neuroscience to explain human behavior. And I was sort of caught up in that idea that, neuroscience, it explains everything. It will tell us why we're conscious. But of course, everyone was dramatically overestimating the explanatory value of neuroscience for psychology.
So what was your major?
Well, initially it was neuroscience. Then I had my whole undergraduate existence was really bizarre, but I had a weird incident where my best friend at UChicago had a psychotic break.
Can I ask you a little bit about your friend's psychotic break? Sure. What did that look like?
It's a bit of a long story, but he was a brilliant person. When I went to UChicago has this reputation of being where fun goes to die. That's the thing that people say about it. That's the catch line. And I thought, I don't want fun. I want to sit in a Gothic library and read and not party. I want to just be involved in this secluded intellectual life, and I'll have an Adderall prescription, and I'll have great works of literature and science, and that will enrich me. But then I got there, and I was so unhappy, not with the classes, but with the people there. I felt that it wasn't a choice to be a nerd that people were making, that it was the only thing that people could be, and that people were very culturally unaware. And this friend of mine was, he'd been in a band, he was culturally aware, he had seen films that weren't The Big Lebowski, and I thought, okay, this guy is really interesting. And he was also very interested in psychedelic drugs, which I was becoming very obsessed with. And
And he was very much my equal. Now I've been studying this so much that it's a little bit hard for me to think back to a time when my knowledge of the subject was more casual, but we both were obsessed and we both knew the same amount about psychedelics. And we had ordered, or actually he had ordered, a chemical that's a derivative of psilocin, the chemical in psilocybin-containing mushrooms that is metabolized into psilocin when you ingest it. And we were on a break in Times Square, or his friend had an apartment in Chelsea. We both took 22 milligrams of this psilocin derivative, psilocin prodrug, and I felt it within 15 minutes. He didn't feel it at all. He was a little bit bigger than me, and he was sort of frustrated by my enjoyment of the experience because he wasn't feeling it at all. And he said, "Okay, I'm gonna weigh out another 22 milligrams. I'm gonna put it in my pocket and keep it with me in case I want to take more later." And so I said, "Okay, yeah, sure." So we leave the apartment. We're walking to Times Square, and he had a congenital heart defect that would sometimes come up in these psychedelic experiences, where it was a source of fear when he would take various drugs. And he was actually much more reckless with drugs than me. I remember this was before ayahuasca was a thing. I had actually not even heard of ayahuasca really myself, and I remember going into his dorm room when he was making ayahuasca in the kitchen, and I said, "Oh wow, you're making that here? Wow, okay." And he said, "Yeah, I'm going to take it, and we can go to a party." And I said, "Okay." And he's like, "Do you want some ayahuasca? You have visions of having sex with aliens when you drink it." And I thought, well, you should take it first, and then maybe I'll try it later. Yeah. And I remember, we're on the way to the party, and he was vomiting through his nose, walking down the street in Chicago and all this stuff. And so he was very extreme in his use, and he also liked opiates in a way that I was very cautious. Yeah. So that was also a time when you could order dried poppy pods on the internet very easily. So he was making poppy pod tea periodically, and I remember there was a little bit of tension between us where I was uncomfortable with his enjoyment of opiates, but it wasn't a huge source of argument between us. But anyway, so he went into an ATM booth, snorted some of this material, but actually snorted the full 22 milligrams, so I had double the dose and had snorted half of it, and came out and said I felt a shooting pain in my heart right after snorting that. And I said, "Oh well, you're probably okay, but be careful." And we kept walking. We went into the basement of a Sparrow in Times Square, and we started saying, I'm gonna drop out of Chicago, or I don't want to go back. It's not a good place. And I was saying, well, you're just a hedonist, and you're just the Pauly Shore archetype, and you just want to use opiates all day.
God, it's the last thing you want to hear when you're
yes. And he's like, well, you're just a miserable Edgar Allan Poe archetype, and you just want to be an artist who's suffering in pain. And I said, well, yeah, fine, then I am the Edgar Allan Poe archetype, and you are the Pauly Shore archetype. And then it like this argument sort of exploded, and he ran out of the Sparrow and disappeared. And this was before smartphones or anything like that, so I was sort of lost in the psychedelic experience in Times Square by myself, thinking that my best friend at the time may have died, which was difficult for me, but he was going through something much more difficult. He was having a psychotic break, and he'd grabbed a cop and had said, "I'm dying, call an ambulance." They'd sent him to Bellevue or wherever. And then from there, it's a long story. I'm still actually friends with him. I talked to him 2 days ago, but he became schizophrenic.
So his life was permanently, radically altered by this experience?
Yes. Yeah. And I don't blame the psychedelic for this. This is something, when I talk about this, it's a little bit hard because it sounds so obvious that the psychedelic must have caused what happened to him. But that was, the same age that people typically have psychotic breaks. Yeah. And there were, even though for the most part he did not have these sorts of indications you typically see in the prodromal period before a psychotic break, he wasn't withdrawn or anything like that. There were tiny indications that had begun to emerge. Yeah, so that's that story.
Wow. How did that experience change you?
It really
gave me a very intimate appreciation of the power of psychedelics, and it made me think, okay, maybe every time I use a psychedelic, I'm rolling the dice with my sanity.
Xenon episode. So you went through this experience where you were inhaling xenon gas. So what is xenon gas, and what was that like?
So on the periodic table of elements, you have a column. It is the rightmost column on the table, and it's called the noble gases. And most people will be familiar with helium, which is of course used in balloons. It's lighter than air, so it floats. And then you have other noble gases that are lesser known, like argon, krypton, neon, radon, and xenon. And the other noble gases do not have as many uses, partially because they're very unreactive. That's what the name means. They're noble in the sense that they don't react with other compounds. And that was what initially made them chemically interesting. They're also components of our atmosphere. They're in every breath that we take. Anyone that is listening to this is breathing every gas that I just named, except for radon, I hope. So they're used in neon lighting and neon signs. They're used in film projector bulbs. They're used in car headlights. They're used in ion thrusters for different types of like satellites and things like that. They have a lot of interesting niche uses, but what makes xenon really interesting pharmacologically is that it's an anesthetic at normal baric pressure. So some of these other gases, if you were to enter a hyperbaric chamber, or if you were to go 100 feet beneath the surface of the ocean under high pressure, it would begin to induce an anesthetic effect, but that effect would be lost at sea level. Xenon is the exception. Xenon is an anesthetic at normal baric pressure, meaning that if you just fill a balloon with it and inhale that xenon, it will have a very powerful anesthetic effect. It's qualitatively similar to nitrous oxide, for anyone who's tried that, aka laughing gas. Widely used as a pediatric dental anesthetic, and it's a bit stronger than nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is not quite capable of inducing general anesthesia, especially when co-administered with oxygen, which you have to do, whereas xenon is. So it can cause a total loss of consciousness in somebody that is inhaling it. And by the standards of most anesthesiologists that I interviewed, it's basically the perfect anesthetic. Because of its lack of reactivity, it produces no metabolites. It can be recycled. It doesn't produce any known toxic interactions with the body, which nitrous oxide does. And the major drawback is that this is a trace component of our atmosphere. And so in order to collect xenon for medical use, you have to distill millions or billions of liters of air to a liquid, and then you have to do cryogenic fractional distillation of that liquid air in order to isolate this trace xenon component.
Oh.
Demons be gone!
Be gone, demons.
Be gone, 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 be gone.
Leave this studio!
Greetings, my beautiful friends. I'm excited. I'm happy. Is that a better way to say it? I'm enthusiastically invigorated by today's guest, Hamilton Morris, a true luminary in the psychedelic universe.
Anytime you get like a kind of a great show meeting something that is not anti-psychoactive substances, I think it benefits everybody because it shows, yeah, you can. I mean, there's the opening of the Xenon Gas episode. you're inhaling a balloon of a gas that I'd only vaguely heard of and had no idea it was psychoactive. Incredible. Do you ever feel like you're putting yourself in danger doing this?
No, and I think that is sort of an interesting question. Is there's often, at least in terms of the consumption of the psychoactive substances, there's often this idea that it's very dangerous. There are very dangerous things that happen in the show, but the consumption of the psychoactive drugs is not one of them, I would say. I think for so long people have associated drug use with self-destruction. Like they consider, even people that enjoy drugs, even people that are in favor of drugs, that think that they should be legal, that think they should be researched, many of those people still on some level believe that the use of a psychoactive drug is self-destructive. And I think that one of the major things that I try to communicate is it doesn't need to be that way. And you can use these things in a way that is not only not destructive, but constructive. It actually will help you. It will make you better than you were. And I think that that's an important lesson. Of course, not all use is like that, and it requires an enormous amount of discipline and research and care in order to achieve the best effect from these experiences. But I think it's just important to keep that in mind, that this is not something that people need to be ashamed of or think is inherently bad for any reason.
I love psychoactive substances. They have been a huge benefit in various parts of my life. But Hamilton, I cannot get the effect of growing up during the war on drugs out of my head. There's always some underlying sense of doing something wrong, of, this is somehow getting off the track of what a life should be. And these are things that I passionately love. Do you have that in you at all?
Yes.
Or did you have it?
Oh, I do. Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Are there things that we can't measure?
There are things that we haven't measured, and there are many, many, many things that we don't know. So I want to be very clear about that. But sometimes people get this impression that science has explained everything, or that there's no mystery in the world. There is enough mystery to last every scientist internationally for as long as humanity will ever be around. There's no shortage of mysteries. If you are believing in a materialist scientific framework, that is to say, you believe that we live in a reality that is made of matter, that doesn't include spiritual things that are not material in their nature, then it should be testable via the scientific method. So that's the basic idea. So I think that especially in the realm of psychology, there are all sorts of things that we don't understand. There's a famous psychiatrist named John Micc. He was very interesting in that he was an expert on alien abduction, and his basic attitude toward alien abduction was, it doesn't matter if alien abduction is real or not. What matters is that people think it's real. And if people think it's real, then it's real. And so I have to treat the people who have had these experiences as if it's real, because it is real to them. So it doesn't matter whether, you could spend your whole life saying, no, you weren't abducted, actually. You weren't abducted. Where's your evidence? Show me the evidence. At that point, then you're foolishly neglecting to address the actual issue, which is that this person thinks they were abducted. So I think that there are all sorts of things that are psychologically real, that are perceptually real, that may not be materially real, but that doesn't mean that they're not important.
Have you
had psychedelic experiences that have challenged your materialist views? Have you ever been shaken?
No, and again, this is another thing. So when I say that, that's not to say that I haven't had utterly extraordinary experiences. I've had experiences where my entire concept of time disintegrated, where I didn't know who I was, where I thought I was my father or my grandfather, where I was traveling down my genetic lineage back in time, where I didn't know anything about myself. And these are extraordinary experiences psychologically. I just don't feel the need to explain them supernaturally. I can say, the DMT bound to my 5-HT2A receptor and it caused glutamate release in the prefrontal cortex and caused this, disruption of the default mode network and this or that happened, whatever. You can explain these things pharmacologically. It doesn't capture the psychological essence or the experiential essence of what occurred, but I just don't feel the need to invoke spirits or the astral plane, or simply because I don't think they have explanatory value. What is really happening is that I am comfortable saying that I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. You couldn't spend, how much time could you possibly spend on drug education in school? But it's like, well, there's a lot of drugs.
Isn't 1 in 5, I'm pretty sure 1 in 5, and it could be worse given COVID because everybody is on some sort of antidepressant. Like the rates of prescription for benzodiazepines and antidepressants has skyrocketed with COVID. But I thought what I last read was 1 in 5 people in the States are on some sort of psych med.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a huge percentage of the population. So there could easily be a few courses in school that taught you how to deal with these things when they're inevitably introduced to you. It's really ridiculous that we're not there yet. It's dangerous given the fact that everyone's on medication.
Yeah, and I think it can all be integrated into, teaching neuroscience and pharmacology. They're all interconnected in such a way that it doesn't need to be like
an extra drug course.
An extra drug course.
It could be in chemistry even.
I think it's all really interesting and useful. It certainly wouldn't be bad to teach children about pharmacology. I think it would be really. I was obsessed with poisons, from the very beginning. So I think that people would actually be kind of receptive to it. But yeah, it's very tricky. It's very hard with the personal responsibility aspect as well, because I know that it's a lot to ask, like a normal person, especially, older people, you can't expect them to learn pharmacology from scratch in order to take a medication. I get that it's very complicated, but I think the ideal situation is one where the substances that people want are available should they want them, and they are assumed to take responsibility for their own actions, 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 their own actions. Pretty crazy story. It is a crazy story, and what I really appreciate about what he does is I think there's a lot of perhaps justified insecurity in the world of drugs. So people have been oppressed for such a long time that they need a justification of some kind. I'm using psychedelics because it's religious. my choice as an adult. Even if it's bad for me, it's my choice as an adult.
Yeah.
It needs no justification.
Like whiskey.
Yeah.
I mean, whiskey's celebrated, it's on television. You can watch ads for whiskey during TV shows. It's like, celebrate it. Have a glass of whiskey. And I like whiskey, but you drink a lot of whiskey, it will fuck you up. And we don't care. We're just accustomed to it. It's become a part of our culture. So it's a traditional use. It's sanctioned by the government. You got a nice tax stamp on it, and so we're okay with it.
But all these patterns I just described emerged during Prohibition as well. So alcohol is prohibited. So you have medical whiskey. You get a prescription from your doctor for whiskey because it's good for your nerves.
One of our sponsors, Buffalo Trace, they've been around longer than the United States. They've been around since 1773, and they made whiskey during Prohibition. They're still running. They're the longest running distillery in America, and they made whiskey for medicinal purposes during Prohibition. It's kind of hilarious.
And of course we see it with cannabis as well. And I get it. I understand why people are doing this because it remains very controversial, and so you want some kind of justification. But you should remember, at the end of the day, that no justification should be required. And if you get too lost in the justification, you may forget why you're doing it in the first place.
I'm being a bit of a waste man, I should be working, I should be studying, I should be being productive, and that's almost exclusively because of how you've been socialized. What do other people say about people who take that drug?
It's true and it's not true. It's very complicated, I think, with cannabis. That's one of the more complicated ones because I think that one of the advantages and disadvantages of cannabis is that it allows you, at least allows me, it does different things to everyone. It allows me to take things less seriously, a lot less seriously, and that's great sometimes, and not great as a daily alteration of consciousness.
So, it's very easy for me to just, I'm receiving like 100 emails a day from disgruntled weirdos, and I think,
Oh, what is wrong with these people? How could they possibly watch what I made and think and extract that of all possible interpretations? What is going on? But then if I'm stoned, I think, all right, well, I don't know. I guess people think strange things, and that's just the way it's going to be for that guy. And so that can be extremely beneficial if you're living a frustrating life, or you're just totally occupied with your professional responsibilities or your studies or whatever. But too much of it, at least for me, and it has a bit of a dissociative type effect where I'm not as engaged with the world, which again can be beneficial. It really just depends on the context. And I agree with you that you could make a valid argument that this is all conditioning, and especially conditioning from a capitalist society that values productivity over everything else, over joy, over relaxation, over camaraderie with friends, over almost anything. So yes, I think that there are many extremely stoned people who are living a beautiful existence that is disconnected from our American, European value system, that where if you're not just constantly generating things, you're of no value. And of course, there are also people that get stoned all the time and are immensely productive and are able to, do huge amounts of work. And I have a lot of respect for those people. I'm not one of them.
No, me neither. Do you think any drugs should be illegal? What's your stance on the legalization of drugs?
No, I do not think any drugs should be illegal. I think that, and I'm aware that my perspective on this can sound a little bit doctrinaire, and I try to remember that there are people who are just so irresponsible that maybe certain types of regulations are required for public safety. Certainly I think that it's really good that radioactive materials are regulated. I do. I think it's that's the thing. The more time that I spend thinking about these subjects, and I think about them every day and have for over a decade, the more unsure I am about almost everything. And I don't find myself agreeing with almost any simple interpretation of anything that's happening. I read these two books. There was a book that came out recently, Empire of Pain, and then there was a book before that, Painkiller, about the Sackler family. And they make a very persuasive case that the Sackler family behaved in a totally unethical and greedy way in order to make an enormous amount of money selling oxycodone.
But it's not only them.
Certainly not, no.
I listened to your Joe Rogan episode where you guys talked about that, who were complicit, and I feel like sometimes people get so focused on like the one person as like a scapegoat instead of looking at like the systematic issue of like, how did this even become a thing?
Right. And that's the crucial question. Did Richard Sackler do all of this? No, it was an enormous network that involved thousands and thousands of people, including the users themselves. And if we just pretend that no physicians knew, none of the people using the drugs knew, no one had any idea what was going on except for Richard Sackler, then we're doing everyone a disservice because we're buying into a lie that feels good. It feels good to have one bad guy, and you could say, Richard Sackler, lock him up, take away his money, give him the chair. But where does that put us the next time something like this happens? And it's never going to stop happening. We will always live in a world where people are trying to sell us things that make us feel good that might be bad for us, whether it's drugs or junk food or social media or who knows what else. I mean, this is just the reality of our existence, and the only way that we will be able to survive in this world is through cultivating a sophisticated understanding of those dynamics and learning to deal with our own suffering in the healthiest possible way, which is not easy, but that's the reality. And so, like, I have a friend who was very addicted to heroin, and he said something to me recently that I thought was really useful. And he said, people in serious recovery, people who are in Narcotics Anonymous meetings, are not blaming the Sacklers for their problems, right? That's journalists. That's people who are telling stories because it feels good to tell the story. But when you're in the thick of it, and you're trying to get better, where does blaming Richard Sackler get you? It gets you nowhere, because ultimately it's your life, your decisions, and your own survival that matter. It's your life, your decisions, it's your life, and your own survival that matter. Your life, your decisions, it's your life and your own survival that matters. It's your life.
Demons be gone!
Be gone, demons. Be gone. Leave this studio.